Hi, this is Steve Wells.
And I'm Jeffrey Feldberg. Welcome to the Sell My Business podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by Deep Wealth. Are you a business owner who's wondering how to either grow your business, sell it, or both? Or maybe in today's environment, you're wondering how to make your business pandemic-proof. Visit deepwealth.com to find out how you can master the strategies to grow and extract the deep wealth from your business. Visit www.deepwealth.com.
Today, we're delighted to have Leon Goren with us. Leon believes in purposeful leadership, the type that requires us to challenge the status quo, anticipate the future, and be confident enough to step outside of our comfort zone to inspire and help those around us excel. Leon's 25 years of leadership experience and understanding of the needs and challenges of leaders comes from leading multiple organizations and working with over 1,000 Fortune 500 and SME clients. Leon, welcome. We're delighted to have you. Your background is as varied as your talents. Why don't you tell our community who you are, a bit of your story, and what you've been doing during this whole pandemic that we've been going through?
Sure. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, Stephen. Background. Well, many of your audience will laugh. I started my career as an entrepreneur when I was 13 delivering newspapers, but then went in the exact opposite direction, became a CPA CA, which really is an accountant for those that don't know the CPA designation. But after doing about 8 years of that, sort of the entrepreneurial piece came back. So I've been involved in all types of things, after leaving the profession, working in Boston for Deloitte, and then Boston up in Canada as well. I started a .com back in 97, 98 called justwhiteshirts.com. It's still around, where I really got to do some entrepreneurial stuff and lead a business. And I followed that by becoming involved with PEO Leadership about 10 years later. I started as a member, and then 10 years back now, I actually bought the organization. So I started to focus much more on strategy and leadership and helping leaders succeed. So that's a little bit of a background about me. Obviously, family guy, 3 kids, and a fantastic wife as well. I have to add that in there. So the last 5 weeks, my work is really about helping leaders. I've been doing that for 10 years. And obviously, over the last 5 or 6 weeks, the world has turned upside down a little bit. What used to be pretty not straightforward advice, because people are human. We always got challenges in terms of what we're dealing, whether it be business, health, wealth, family, relationships. But 5 weeks ago, obviously in North America, what we found was obviously with the coronavirus coming and impacting and then shutdowns, the world changed for many leaders. So our focus has really been there to support these individuals, actually to try and be a couple of weeks ahead of the game. Because as you're going through crisis, a lot of our leaders going through crisis, they're in the midst of it. And so what they look to us to do is sort of help them through the midst of it, but also to think a couple of steps forward in terms of pulling their heads out of the mud a little bit to think about what's coming down the path here. So that's really what's been preoccupying us. And it hasn't let off yet. We've gone through crisis. We're now going through a bit of a transition. And I think over the next 30 to 60 days, we're going to move into what we call a recovery or a reset into this new economy. And so, again, all sort of very, very new to leaders today. So the ability to tap into each other, into each other's wisdom, to see how everyone's moving forward, to learn from each other. And for us to sort of facilitate that journey has been, from what I'm hearing, somewhat invaluable to many of them.
Leon, I want to hear more about your organization and what you're doing right now. But I got a quick question. I mean, because you had a company, I imagine in 08, which 07, 08, that 09, we went through a recession. Probably, I can't imagine we went through it as well, but nothing like we're going through now. From that experience, is there any takeaways or anything that you saw then that you can apply now?
Well, the number one thing, if you think even 5 weeks ago, as the virus was starting to hit, and you started getting inklings around businesses shutting down. So 07, 08, what starts to happen, revenue starts to decline. It's a little slower than what we're seeing here happening to us about 4 or 5 weeks ago. So there's a lot of similarities. The first one being understanding where you are with your cash flow today. So, that was the first thing we went up to our members and said, okay, how many of you actually have built? I don't care about your business plans. I want to see a 12-month cash flow. I want it on a monthly basis. And if you can actually do it, let's do it on a weekly basis and see where we're at. And that'll depend on the size of the business, right? My multinational guys are not doing that. but my entrepreneur guys are definitely doing that. So that's number one. The second conversation that happened in '08 and happened here too was, what am I going to do when I look at that cash flow and I realize, oh my God, we're running negative here. We didn't have, today we've got companies that have dropped down to zero revenue. About 10% of our membership is probably at zero revenue. In '08, we didn't have that. People dropped 20, 25%, 30%. Here we got zero. But the same parameters, the same things existed. So, cash flow is the first thing. The second thing then is, okay, where can we actually cut costs to actually be able to ensure we can actually come out of this? So the number one item on most P&Ls today are employees. So a lot of conversations start to happen around the employee. What can we do? '08, we looked at work share programs. What did we do 5 weeks ago? We looked at work share programs. In '08, they didn't have as much around work subsidies and those financial assistance programs, both in the US and also Canada, pretty well all around the world. Today, 5 weeks ago, they started thinking about that. They started implementing them over the last few weeks. How does that impact? Can we actually carry our employees today? So you start running the numbers. You start looking at furloughs. There were a lot of layoffs. There were a lot of conversations about, can I roll back salaries? And that was a big thing in '08 was, can I roll back people's salary for 20% by 20%? Does that help us on the cash flow? Does that make sure that we can actually continue? And we've had those conversations here again in 2020. One of the most interesting things I heard in one of my groups is, this was about 4 weeks ago, they ran a town hall with their employees. And the fellow got up and says, really, we have two options because we're looking at this. And it's really important that the business is able to survive, because if we don't survive, even if we put all of you on furlough, it doesn't do you any good in terms of coming back. So how do we do this? So we have two options. One is, yes, we can lay off 30 or 40% of the staff here. Or two is, we can unanimously agree that we're all going to take a setback in our wages. We're going to roll back our wages 30%. And what he did is he put it out in an anonymous survey to the group, came back 24 hours later, and unanimously everyone agreed they would take the rollback. So pure transparency, engagement, inspiration of that team. And, there's a company that I believe will succeed coming right out of this thing.
Leon, you've shared some terrific strategies, both from '08 as well as today. And maybe we can segment this into two buckets. The old saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. So coming out of '08, and it may not be helping some business owners right now and today, if you would have had a crystal ball and said, okay, coming out of '08, and we're going to fast forward to today, what would be the top 2, 3, maybe 4 things to do in preparation for the next big downturn, whether it's a pandemic or something close to a pandemic? And then from there, we'll switch. But what would that be right now with your experience with your own company and with your membership and just speaking to leaders? What would that have been? What could someone start thinking about today?
Well, the first thing is probably the easiest thing to do. Forget about the cash flow side. We're moving off of that right now. The most important thing you actually need to do is communicate. So what is communication? We talk about this with leaders all the time. Most of our leaders believe they communicate really well. Most of them actually are quite poor at communications. In a time of crisis, whether it be in '08 or 2020, as you're moving through this, transparency over communication, putting yourself in the situation of those people that you're working with, being able to inspire them is probably the most important piece to ensure that you're actually going to come out of this well. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is people need to believe in something. When they're going through this type of environment, you talk about hope. That's part of the leader's job. They really have 2 things. One is they better understand the vision in terms of where we're going to go. And the second thing they got to be understand is, how am I going to engage and inspire my people? So they need to portray, true leaders actually come out in these times. So communication, allowing them to believe in what you're doing and where you're going forward is absolutely critical. The second piece then becomes, I define it as crisis, transition, recovery. So even in 2020 right now, we're a bit in transition. So the key is, as a leader, how am I going to start? I need to think about the future. Now I'm not going to think about 5 years down the road. What I need to start thinking about is in the next 2 to 3 months. What is it that, what's my world or our world going to look like 3 months from today? And what you're trying to do is really start to think outside of the box. And I think it's even more important in 2020 than it was in 2008. Because in 2020, there's a lot of discussion here. This is going to be a total reset. And a great example is, look how we're doing this interview. We're doing it through Zoom. What does that mean to real estate in the future in terms of office space? I can tell you already a number of our leaders are thinking about, I'm never bringing my staff back into the same environment we were in before. So how are we going to operate? How are we going to work? So those companies and those leaders that start thinking about where are we going to be 3 to 6 months down the road are the ones that are actually going to come out really, really well. The third piece, and maybe it's even the first piece, is to understand, even in 08, when crisis hits, it's all doom and gloom. And the reality is, we're human beings and we're wired to be resilient. And so in every situation I've ever seen, and maybe we're fortunate in the generation that we're living in, but people come back, society comes back, we go through problems, but we always seem to pull through it. And so again, it's that belief saying, yeah, things are lousy today. Things are lousy in my company, but you know what? They're not always going to be lousy. We were doing really well before. How are we going to make it great again? And so that mindset, and that reinforces the communication element again. And it also gives you the energy to start thinking out of the box again in terms of reinventing your business. So those are some of the ideas I've got around that.
Leon, on that last point, do you have any examples or any thoughts? Like, there will be people who really thrive, or they will pivot, they will do something, and it could be in their industry gives them that advantage, or even they have a industry that's particularly affected by it, and they somehow figure out how to solve that. Do you have any examples for that?
In our own business, for example, we start thinking out of the box, and we were lucky before these even hit. We started launching these North American groups without getting people on planes. We started doing Zoom calls. So even in our business, when I look at our business in the future, and I'm already hearing it from my advisors who run my groups, we have better attendance. We run weekly meetings. We don't run monthly meetings now. The frequency's high. There's Zoom calls. That whole face-to-face element is changing. In fact, what it's doing is enabling us to broaden the market here and be everywhere in the world, where we never thought we could do that before. We were thinking about smaller communities, touch points, face-to-face, being able to touch people and deal with them. So that's a little bit from our own perspective. We were talking the other day on the financial markets, for example, this whole debt crisis, right? So you're managing debt today, and this is a little bit more on the wealth side, but it's a business that does that. They build funds and they build bonds and stuff. If you looked at March, it was an absolute disaster. A lot of them dropped 20%. But at the end of the day, going forward, if they drop it right there, chances are, yeah, they're done. But they do know at the end of the day, if they keep with it and keep pushing forward, they're actually going to come back in the coming months, as long as they were wise in terms of what investments they had made. So again, it's most businesses here they were thriving before, they're going to thrive again. It's just the confidence in believing that that's going to happen. I don't have I don't have specific examples for you around, well, no one knows yet because we haven't come out of 2020. And in 2008, I don't think the reset was as harsh, except for the banking industry, really. Most of our businesses at that time survived. I mean, they just carried forward. It hit them. Canada, we were operating a little bit in Canada at the time, more so than we do today with a global group in the US. But the banking industry didn't even get hit as hard in the Canadian marketplace. So people, they felt the ripple, but they came out through pretty well.
Leon, I'd like to circle back on your points about communication. And firstly, as I heard you talk about hope and communication, I was thinking this guy should run for office. It's a terrific message. There's a saying, and I believe business owners more than most can relate to it. It's lonely at the top. Doesn't matter if it's good times. particularly in challenging times. It's lonely at the top. There's not a lot of people who you can share things with, even if you wanted to, and people just don't understand. So there's an element of having, some people call it a personal board of advisors. Some people call it a mastermind group. But what you're doing in PEO of bringing leaders together in these confidential forums or confidential mastermind groups, how does that help, not just in pandemic times, but just in general? Should leaders out there coming out of this pandemic, and if they're asking the question, how do I pandemic proof my business on a go forward basis, would you think a mastermind group should be at the top of the list? And why yes or why not no?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think if you're gonna ask somebody here that's totally unbiased in my answer here, but I think if you asked our members today, they would tell you it's been of incredible support through this period of time, because they're faced with, and we're just talking about this particular time, but I'll tell you the importance of it all year round. But in this critical time, it's the unknown, right? So you're sitting there, whether there are 10 people in your group from different industries, willing to share. And one of the important pieces is to be vulnerable. So it's not about wins, but really getting into being able to expose yourself. And that's kind of talks to being lonely at the top. When you're in front of your employees and your stakeholders, you need to be positive, you need to be transparent, but you got to exude hope. When you come into a mastermind group, it's one of the few chances that you have to sort of sit there and go, I need to take a deep breath here because I'm just being overwhelmed. And here are some of the big mountains I need to climb, and I really can use some input. So that vulnerability is actually playing a huge part in allowing others in that group to make a difference for you. So, you come into this crisis here, and we're sitting here and going, I've just watched my revenue drop by 50%. I have to deal with my employees. I've had a phenomenal culture in our organization up to this point. We've never let people go. We've trained people. We've allowed people to develop. And here we are today sitting, and I actually have to furlough a bunch of employees. It's going to destroy my culture. I've never done this before. How do I do it? So, in the mastermind groups that we run, or the groups that we run, I talk about three things when you come into that room. Pose a question. Are you looking for clarity? Give us the facts, pose the question, and say, okay, I'm looking for some clarity. I got to make some. Am I looking for some counsel from everyone in the group? Or third, am I looking for some courage? And so if you can premise those conversations around those three C's, what you're doing in helping everyone around that table is huge. It's an environment where the door is closed. You can challenge, you can be challenged. As long as you're willing to open up, number one. Number two is you have to be able to listen. You may not take everything. You may rework things. It proves to be invaluable because, Jeffrey, what you're doing in your business, and if you're posing a question to the group and you're seeking some counsel, chances are, if I'm sitting opposite you and I'm putting my headspace into your headspace in terms of helping you solve, as a leader, there's a very high probability that I'm dealing with something very similar. A great example is, during good times, is I've got a team of 7 executives that work for me. I got a C performer as one of the 7. I don't know how to handle it. It's a very difficult thing for me to do. I'm not used to letting people go. Here's my question to the group. How do I do it? How do I deal with this? Do I hire a coach to help them excel? Do I spend more time? Do I invest in this individual? Or do I really pull the trigger? And so you're asking a group to sort of feed into the challenge that you're dealing with. And as they are, I can guarantee almost everyone in that room is probably thinking through it in their own business as well, in their own frame, and saying, I probably got that C player on my team too. Here I'm telling Leon what he should do. But actually, as I self-reflect, I'm thinking, holy shit, why am I not moving on this as well? Here, it's so easy to tell somebody else, but I should actually be doing it myself. And so you're getting tremendous value. And that's the value you're starting to receive throughout the entire year, because those are decisions that are being made on an ongoing basis.
And I imagine for people who aren't familiar with a mastermind group, and when you think about it, we can go back to biblical times with that Jethro and Moses, where Jethro said, Moses, here's how you're going to manage and lead all these people, through to King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Even Richard Branson and Oprah have said, my success I attribute to a mastermind group. But if you haven't been a part of that, I'm sure there's some people who are saying, what, I'm going to sit around a table of strangers and just put it all out there of what's going on? And, what about my competition? Are they going to be hearing all of this? And how do I deal with that? So what would be, if you're going to be setting up a mastermind group, joining an organization like yours or setting one up on your own, what in your experience constitutes an effective mastermind group?
So I believe my world's a little different. I truly believe, we're here to help people succeed in a very holistic way. Like I said, it's business, health, wealth, family, career. And we use the mastermind as one element of a three-legged stool to actually allow them to get there. The mastermind itself, I'll tell you right now, it's not for everyone. So for example, if you lead, and there's not many leaders like this, but if you're a dictator and you lead through a dictatorship in a sense, and I know some guys that have been women and men who've been very successful in that type of building wealth in their business that way, you're not going to be able to sit in that group because you're not going to be wanting to listen to others and be attacked or not attacked, but challenged on some of your thinking, because that's not what you're accustomed to. So, you already remove a piece of the population from the mastermind. The individuals that thrive, it really comes down to being able to say, I want to continue to learn. And one of the best ways to learn is through examples and real-time situations. And so a mastermind actually fulfills that. It's like going to business school, except business school is looking at cases that have been done over years. Whereas if you're in a mastermind, if done properly, you're looking at a real-time, real case situation. And when you're sitting there across the table and listening to someone go through the challenge that they're dealing with, it actually sticks better with you than if you were reading a case and having to discuss a case around a classroom, because there's a relationship with that individual. There's an element, within us as human beings to be able to give that you're actually doing in that mastermind group, which provides you with a sense of gratification, actually, that you're actually trying to make a difference to this individual. So those are the characteristics of an individual, both an individual and how a mastermind group succeeds. Again, it's vulnerability. It's about really bringing to the group issues and opportunities that are challenging to you, that they're not easy to get to. You're finding difficult, and you want to leverage the wisdom around that table. If you can't do that, then I would tell you, don't join a mastermind group. You're actually you're not doing yourself a favor, and you're not doing anybody in that group a favor.
Hey, Leon, I have the privilege to mentor a lot of younger, I'm a boomer, I'm 64, a lot of younger men primarily, not too many women, but it doesn't matter. I found the younger generation much more willing to listen and be guided and actually look toward that guidance as being very helpful versus, maybe I'm speaking just for myself, maybe my generation. Do you find that characteristic in the mastermind, and do you see younger people wanting to do that more than, let's say, boomers?
Not necessarily. So, we're skewed a little bit older, right? Because you're dealing with some big leaders. Like I said, we're dealing with some big Fortune 500 businesses. And so you don't typically have a 20 or a 30-year-old individual leading that group. In the entrepreneurial side, we do get a little younger. And I find you're right, the millennials, very grateful, easy to open up. They're used to the dialogue around the table. But I come back to there are a good group, even in a boomer, it may be harder to get them over the first hump. But once you get them over the first hump, and that first hump, what I'm saying is the connectivity among themselves. They don't need to love everybody in that group, but they need to respect each other. And they need to feel for each other, and they need to have the desire to actually make a difference to everybody in that room. So there are exercises, for example, with boomers. We've done it more with boomers than we've done it with young people, where you get to open them up, whether it be, ideas like lifelines, where people are walking through some of the 10 most highs and lows of of their lives. Nothing even sometimes to do with business, but really creates that atmosphere of opening up vulnerability. And then you get a group that just changes immediately into a group that becomes so well connected that anything can be put on the table. So maybe boomers, we had to work a little bit harder in terms of getting them to that point. Millennials, much more, they're like sponges, I call them millennials, especially on the entrepreneurial side. They pull everything in. The one thing I will notice about millennials, though, is they jump. So when I think about loyalty in these groups, and loyalty is a huge thing to me, because one, I'm a loyal person, but two is this group is a giving group, not a taking group. I don't want takers. I want people that do both. And what does that mean? Well, that means in that first year in that group, you could be taking, you could be giving, or maybe you're taking a lot more. And I've dealt with this with entrepreneurs. I'll tell you a story in a moment. But in year two, you sit there, and I don't want you pulling out and say, thanks very much. I've gotten to point B where we talked about getting to point B. It's time for me to move on. My question to them is, okay, what did you give back to the group? They're the one that helped you get to point B. Now you're just pulling out like that. That makes a lot of sense. I actually find that more common with millennials than I do with baby boomers. And if I break out the demographics, I'll even say men are worse than women are unbelievable in these groups. They're actually the stickiness and the glue to these groups. They're the ones that challenge the groups beyond belief. Like they push them, especially when we're dealing with the life element and the relationship between life and business. So that's the challenge I actually have with millennials is, okay, that's great. You want to be part of this. I know you're a huge learner, but you know what? If you want to participate, I want you to understand that it's not about simply taking here. It doesn't work this way. It needs to be both ways. You need to give and you need to take. And this is a long-term investment. You may not be part of, in my world, I basically say you may start in a group, but you may actually outgrow that group and go to another group, but you still remain part of the community. Because the growth is not just within your mastermind, it's in that entire community. That's how we're leveraging the wisdom.
How could you pandemic-proof a business? Maybe you missed the boat on doing that now, but as you look forward, what can you do? And I know here at Deep Wealth, we've been using a lot of P words lately, and one of them is pivot and profit. How do you master the art of pivoting and profiting? And I'm just wondering from your experience, someone who's listening in right now and said, okay, I got to figure out how I'm going to make this thing work. It's a new game. I've never been here before, but it's a new opportunity. What have you seen? What would you be advising? What kind of questions should people be asking?
The number one thing I think all businesses need to think about today is building reserves, because stuff is going to happen. And the challenge today is that for companies that did not build reserves that allow them to survive, even until they get their checks from the government for 1 or 2 or 3 months, are really in a difficult predicament. So that's number one, is if into the future, you're thinking about this again, and there will be waves of this stuff, how do you build a reserve? And funny enough, I have a belief that as those checks hit all the Americans out there that are unemployed and stuff, we will not see them spending money, because they will rationally actually start putting the money aside and building their own reserves from a personal perspective. So it may actually have a different outcome than the government thinks it's going to have in terms of spending, because they are now thinking in a different mindset. But that's number one. Number two is, okay, your other question is, okay, we're in it right now, right? We're suffering. How do we pivot or start to think about profiting coming out of this thing? And I think, two is it really comes back to thinking, what is my business going to look? What's the future? Take a much bigger picture and say, take the industry you're in. What's that industry going to look like? And start to think a little bit out of the box. Think about the people within the consumers, or whether it's B2B. What is going to be important to them when we come out of this thing? So on a consumer side, it's a little bit easier. We're thinking about how are they going to buy? What are they going to buy? What's going to be important to them? So forgetting even your business, you're now thinking about it from an industry, but trying to even understand the consumer more so than you understood it before when you were normally operating. So we're talking strategy. So starting to define that, then trying to understand what are our core strengths here in our business. So, because sometimes your core, that's kind of lost a lot of the time when we do strategy work with a lot of our members, they actually forget what their core strength is in terms of what their value is. They think, oh, I'm just selling a product here. But actually, perhaps it was the procurement, sourcing, and the formulation of that product that was actually your strength, not the distribution of that product. So it's trying to figure out what are our core strengths, understanding what that consumer is going to be, and then trying to reshift in terms of where you're going to go. So let's look at an example. And I think, Stephen, this will bring it back to how do you pivot and what are the companies going to look like coming out of this? So let's look at retail, right? We know retail, stores were closing before the pandemic hit. We know now, coming out of this pandemic, that whatever stores were closing before, multiply that by 5 or 10, because there are going to be bankruptcies everywhere on the retail side. You're a wholesale provider to these stores. So they used to be your customer, your immediate customer, if I'm a wholesale, but you have an end customer, your end consumer at the end of the day. So if I'm sitting there in a consumer goods company today, I'm sitting there looking at that end consumer, trying to understand how are they going to start to buy? How are they going to look at my types of products? What are they going to need? So first thing I'm starting to look at is, one is they're not going to buy necessarily through bricks and mortar. They're starting to buy, e-commerce is going to come at a speed no one's ever imagined because of what's just happened. In fact, we're going to catch up to Asia because they were already way ahead of us on this. So now I'm in the manufacture, design of new consumer products. I'm going to start thinking about where I put my efforts. So when I bring employees back on the reset, am I going to put people into the sales functions driving B2B? Or even during this reset, am I going to start to invest heavily into the e-commerce side, even way beyond that what I've done before? Understanding that most likely I got to start building relationships directly with these consumers, because at the end of the day, that's my only way of being able to reach them. So if I used to sell through Macy's and Macy's disappears tomorrow, I actually have no access to any of my consumers because Macy's was the go-between. I'll take it even further. If I'm selling through Amazon today, I still have no access to my consumers. So I'm trying to think about the reset here, saying, okay, that's not a good environment either. So now I need to think about, great, I don't want to disappoint Amazon. I still want to sell through, but I need to build that relationship with those consumers. So that's the pivot in terms of putting your brain in a different space. It certainly will require some investing, but you're going to have resources to reallocate here as you reset the business.
You know, you make me think, Leon, that one of the values of having a group like yours is that, let's say, you know, you've been a traditional company that's been retail. Now, all of a sudden, you've got to go digital. You're going to use different distribution channels, different marketing channels that you've never done before, and maybe your staff isn't even qualified. Maybe maybe you do have to let people go, but you may need to hire a whole different group of people, or at least at least add to that team. I mean, I would think
Stephen,
that could be a value.
You're absolutely 100% correct. I mean, if you're thinking, you know, what I said to in my role and at our role at PEO Leadership, and this is why mastermind groups don't always work on their own, because mastermind groups, they sit down, they meet once a month. There's usually nobody thinking about them. There's nobody running that meeting. You go, you disperse, you help each other. In our world, I actually got to think about the future. So I actually believe, exactly to your point, what's the next thing coming in the next 30 days? A reset. Businesses are going to start to reopen. Companies have never done this before. I have now seen an opportunity where I can actually look at my entire workforce. I'm now going to match it up to potentially the new strategy. And I got to figure out, how am I going to bring people back? And who am I going to bring back? And what roles are they going to play? This is a whole new open game again in terms of value that these leaders require today. And I bring that into the mastermind groups, because that's what we're going to end up doing in our groups down the road, is having those conversations around the table and sharing the learnings as we bring these people back, and challenging each other to say, should I really bring this person back? Does it, am I really thinking clearly that this person is going to align exactly where I want to go to in terms of where we're going as a business? This is one of the, again, crisis, transition, recovery. This is around the transition recovery. The whole bringing back of individuals is going to be an interesting discussion point about who, when, and how to bring these people back.
Leon, one of the things that I want to go back to, because I agree with what you've said, and we can't say it enough, to build a cash reserve or a rainy day fund or whatever you want to call it. And so both with your experience and also your accounting background, number one, how much is enough in terms of how many months should a business have in reserve? And then how do you do it? What does that look like, particularly when you're doing it for the first time in the middle of a pandemic like we're in right now?
So you can go back to from a personal perspective, right? You always hear about people saving for their retirement and the argument that you should be putting away 10% of your wages all the time into a personal fund, call it a savings fund, right? So I'm going to break this question in two. I'm going to talk it from a personal perspective because I think that's going to impact a lot of your entrepreneurs too. They think about it from a personal perspective as much as they do from a business perspective. And I think they do because if I build enough reserves personally, I can actually infuse capital into my business as well. Okay, so it works. They're very much overlap. So from a personal perspective, let's think about where we are today with this pandemic and let's take some learnings. We are about a month and a half in. They're talking about rebooting the economy. They talk about rebooting it in little sections. We don't know if it's going to work. This could be a 6-month reboot. I don't know what industry you're in. Maybe you're coming in on the tail end. Even when you restart, are you going to be up to 100%? Are you going to start going 25, 50, 60? Maybe it's a year long. So that's kind of your answer right there. So if I know it's going to be, and I would say 6 months to a year here, I'd want to make sure that I've got enough money, primarily number one, that you put food on the table for your family, right? Number two is to have enough money to actually, if necessary, be able to carry the business a bit from a break-even perspective if we ever go through this again. So personally thinking about it, saying, okay, what type of money do I need to last 6 months to a year? And that will differ from person to person, right? It impacts wealthy people as well. They just spend a lot more money. But you think about it, so they need to reserve a year's worth of money. That'll be a lot more than an individual that is not used to having that type of money and can live on much lower salary. So that's part A. So you look at the business. So in a corporation, again, in corporation, we think about not-for-profits, and I talked before we started, maybe I'll start with them. There's going to be a disaster with not-for-profits across all of North America. Most of them are going to suffer like unbelievable. Why? Because people who sat on those boards of all these not-for-profit and philanthropic organizations basically always thought about accountability and spending every dollar for good purpose and use, putting the dollars towards the mission of what they were talking about and not having any type of surplus. Those same board members now are going to learn from this, that because they did that and used their great financial acumen to do that, that those not-for-profits and philanthropic organizations are going to go bankrupt because they have no reserves to actually get through this, and no one is donating and revenue is not coming in during this time. The same applies to business, except in many cases, you don't have a board. It's yourself. You're running as an entrepreneur, running that business. It's to think about it the same way. In a situation that I'm going to have to run break even. So they're called sensitivity analysis if you're an accountant. And you say, okay, at 50% revenue, skeleton staff, I have to go through this again. How much cash do I need every month to continue operations? And let's say I want to do it. I want to make sure that I got 6 months of cash, 6 months to a year's worth of cash. What I start doing is starting to put, whether it be 10%, I start building that cash reserve into that business. Now, there's two ways to build a cash reserve. One, the safest way is to actually build the cash as cash, right? You can put it in short-term deposits, whatever, in government security. The second way to do it is to establish lines of credit with your banks. Now, you can't necessarily do that as easily when you're living in a pandemic or through a crisis. But before you get into that, when things are going well, if you're a small business entrepreneur, let's say you got a $250,000 loan, or today you got a $250,000, push it. You have a great year, go back to the bank and say, you know what, I'd like to move that up to 750. I'd like to move that up to $1 million. I'd like to move that up to $2 million. You may never even actually tap into that operating line. But the idea is You now have an operating line there. So when a crisis or something hits, at least you have the flexibility to draw on that line, at least in the first 30 days. Now, there may be covenants that you're going to break, but, at the end of the day, you're going to break those covenants, but you'll have the cash in the bank. And the bank's not going to come after you, at least not in the early days, we hope. So those would be a couple of tricks. One is slowly accumulating cash over time, saving it for a rainy day, both personally and in your business. And number two, and actually you can do this personally and in your business too, establish those lines of credit when times are good that are far beyond what you require today, because you never know when you're going to have to dip into it.
I have a friend who's a turnaround expert. In good times, he would go in and these companies are going to go under, and he would come in and he would do all kinds of things to change their direction. And I remember he would come in. I remember there's some company and he had them sell assets that they really needed to sell, and they were just emotional reasons. And I always asked him, I said, why do they need you to do this? And they're paying you money. He said they just emotionally couldn't make those decisions. I wonder, and you may not have the answer. I mean, we're in this crisis. I wonder if the emotions in that way are now overcome, that you see you've got to do some things that are tough, like you've outlined.
It's interesting. He's using physical assets. Let me use people as an asset, because a lot of businesses are knowledge-based today and they're driven by people. So people are our asset, right? And again, recently I'm in a group and I'm listening to one of the members in that group, and he has a very difficult decision. He's very emotional around it. He's built a great culture. He really appreciates his people. He's very much a people person. He needs to dispose of those assets. He needs to furlough them temporarily. He may actually have to sever them, right? Those are massive emotional decisions. You think about a mastermind there, and I talked about the 3 C's. What's he looking for there? He already knows the answer. He knows that I am not doing anyone, including myself, any good by not furloughing these people, because in 6 months' time, there's no business. No one will be employed here. So he looks to the group and he sits there. He needs courage, right? He needs support. And again, it's not something with your own employees. You got to be up there standing. You got to believe in what you're saying. You can be transparent. You can be vulnerable, but you have to have enough strength to push forward. In these masterminds, a well-run mastermind group or an advisory board allows that person to say, you know what, this is really weighing on me. This is extremely difficult. And sometimes they're looking really for some courage to do it, to get it done. And so that ties into the fellow that you described, right? He's coming in. In this case, you don't know the sweat and tears that gone into buy those pieces of equipment, right? They may have worked years to be able to do this, to give them the capabilities or a competitive advantage. Who knows what it was? And what he's suggesting is, hey, you can have this great equipment, but you're not going to be around as a business. You need to sell this stuff. And so to me, and again, that's an easier decision than dealing with your employees who are also out. The employees is the most difficult. They're people. That is the most difficult asset to deal with today. Not your physical plants and equipment and warehouse. They're physical, they're material things. You're not dealing with people. You worry when I'm going to furlough someone, how's this person going to put money? Are they going to put food on the table? Are they going to be one of those people in those lines down in Wisconsin or Minneapolis that are around the block 3 times and have to wait overnight to get food for their family? These are very, very difficult emotional decisions that people have to make.
Leon, as we begin to wrap up, you've been a wealth of insights and wisdom, and thank you for that. One question for you is, based on everything that you've experienced coming into today, and as we look at restarting and pivoting and profiting and all the things that we spoke about, what would be one thing, if you could do only one thing starting today as you look forward, what would that be on the business side and as a business owner? What would be one thing that you would start doing today where we are right now in this pandemic?
I'm going to give you 3 things.
always giving more value. Love it.
No, I just thought about this. The last year I ran a conference about resilience. Actually, it was 18. And the timing now, I was worried about resilience with technology coming and all those types of factors. And really, resilience is playing into a pandemic here. That's where you really need resilience. So it's all about resilience. So let me share 4 things that you want to do. One is you need to sit down and envision what you want to see in yourself, how you see yourself in the future. Do you want to be, and you got to do it from a personal perspective. I want to be powerful. I want to be strong. I want to be whatever it is that defines you. That's number 1, because you need to believe in yourself. And I use athletes do this all the time. The best athletes in the world, they always create a vision in terms of where they're going. Whether you're in business or whether you're just surviving life today in your family, create a vision, put yourself in that mode of where you want to be. Number 2, define what's important to you in that business. To you, what's important. So now I understand where I want to be. Now I'm taking into the business sense in terms of saying what's important to me in terms of the business and how does it relate to reinforcing my own essence. Make it attainable, be realistic about it, but include some adventure in it and set measurable goals. Really important right now, right? We talked about the pivot. Understand what's important to you, where are you going to be, what's success look like, bring it back and set the measurable goals. The second thing the third thing that I think is really, really important as a leader is to continually reinforce the positive in your communication. Talk to those employees that are still working with you. Talk to those that you believe are going to be important to you upon their return. Over communicate with them and do so in a way, when I say it's positive, I'll even use my own example. Every Sunday morning, I write a letter to all our members and I share some of the things that have happened in the week. I share member stories. I talk about the future. You know what keeps me going? It's the letters I get back in response to my Sunday morning piece. It's that positive reinforcement, that positive feedback is driving me to make sure that I've got the energy and desire to keep moving forward. So I think about that and I'm like, oh my God, this is something that every person needs. How do we do this? Whether you're internally driven or externally driven, probably more important for externally driven individuals. So constantly providing some type of positive feedback to these people. And the third piece is, or maybe it's the fourth, is the power of gratitude. During these periods of time, do something that's going to make a difference to someone. And you asked me, and we didn't really talk from despair to hope. Those are really a couple of things to move somebody along that line, taking them out of a situation where there's too much coming at them around the crisis. And it's trying to take them into a new place where they're moving towards that place of hope and moving their attitude towards there. And so, gratitude is actually one of the best ways to do it. Make a difference to somebody every day.
Words to the wise. Well, Leon, as we wrap this up, where can people find you if they want to learn more about you and what you're doing? Where would that be?
So the best place is our website is PEO Leadership. There's a hyphen between the PEO and leadership. And so it's PEOleadership.com. You can find me there. My assistant or myself will try and get back to you. We'll do our best. I can't promise, but we'll do our best to try and get back to you. It's been a lot of emails.
We appreciate that. What an interesting interview. What was some really great tips and real practical things that I know are going to be helpful to everyone. Appreciate it.
No, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jeffrey, for taking the time to interview me.
Thank you, Leon, and all the best. Be healthy and safe.